Welcome to the Black Paper. My name is Ndụkwe Ọnụọha.
And I'm Chxta.
Today we have an interesting format to this podcast because we have our very first guest, and I'll leave Chxta to introduce us to this amazing human.
Thank you, Ndụkwe. So we have a guest, JB Vundla. He's a friend and he's a brother. He's also a retired soldier from the British Army and the 5th Regiment or Royal Regiment of Artillery. So he was a gunner. Although don't call him a gunner because he doesn't like arsenal. JB, you want to introduce yourself further?
Thank you. You guys are so kind. Thank you for bringing me on to your podcast. Yeah, I've been a fan for a bit, so you have a fanboy here.
Thank you. That makes us shy since we're still new.
I know I'm a fan of Chxta, and when Chxta asked me to come on, there's a lot of people I could say I can easily say no to, but I'm saying no.
Now you're making me even redder.
It's a privilege. You're my brother now. You're our people. You're my people. So yeah. Thank you. And nice to meet you, Ndụkwe. Thank you for.
Same here, JB. And it's quite interesting. Your name is JB Vundla, and if you close your ears to the last one, so Anton just his initial JBV. One could think we have JB Vans. Oh no, although that's JD, isn't it? But anyway,
yeah, that's JD. I think the accent would betray me, right?
and maybe the common sense approach to life. But anyway,
probably, yeah.
Yeah, so speaking of the accents, JB Vundla is South African British or British South African, however we want to look at it. And one of the things that we're going to talk about today is hyphenated identities. But the main reason that we asked JB to come on today is the fact that there's a huge argument happening in the UK with regards the rise in defense spending. And that naturally has brought on a major argument about the welfare states versus defense spending. Will defense spending trump the welfare states? There's going to be a protest in London later today, spent on welfare, not on warfare. And I think let me take a backseat to ask the hard questions on this.
Well, thank you. I must point out that Chxta does this, and he has just done this deliberately because he reminded me before we started that I'm in the government because I'm a Labour councillor. So when it comes to some of
you're getting your ducks ahead of I should have reminded you so that I would remind you.
But anyway, before we even start with the questions, maybe you served as a gunner in the regular Royal Regiment of Artillery in the British Army. Yeah. Now, for those who don't know, the 5th Regiment Royal Artillery is a regiment of Royal Artillery in the British Army, formed in 1939 as a 5th Regiment Royal Horse Artillery before being redesignated in 1958. Currently serves as a surveillance and target acquisition role and is equipped with counter-battery radars and acoustic sound ranging equipment. It also provides special observation post teams. Now, to regular people like me who hear that and they're scratching their heads saying, what the hell does that mean? What does that mean, B?
Right. So the first thing I think the first thing to mention, or one of the first important thing to mention is that the army is probably one of a few organizations where the left end doesn't know what the right end does.
Oh, okay.
Right. So the artillery doesn't know what the infantry does. Well, so the artillery and the infantry are different because the infantry depends on the artillery. So that's not a good example. So the infantry relies on the artillery. I'll explain what that means. Now, there are a lot of regiments in the army, like intelligence, for instance, has no clue what we do in the artillery. Admin don't know what we do. Then they process our payments and things like that, but they have no idea what surveillance and targeting is. But if there's a group or regiment that understands what targeting is, it's the infantry, because we are the guys that find the targets for them. You see, so surveillance.
How do you find the target? Is that boots on ground or through surveillance equipment, drones, or things like that?
It's mostly surveillance equipment. Now,
right.
Well, I left the army something like 10 years ago, 11 years ago. So even then, the equipment was quite advanced. I mean, we could find a target anywhere using cameras. We don't do drones. Drones is a completely different regiment. I'm not going to mention it because I have nothing to do with it. So they do drones. We do cameras. We do acoustic equipment that listens to projectiles. So by that I mean whatever weapon you fire, we can pick up. Even the smallest arm, we can pick up and then identify using the sound of the.
So that means every well, let's say gun, for instance, has like an audio signature.
Yes, every gun has an audio signature that our equipment picks up. So we have equipment that picks up just the sound. We have equipment that tracks the projectile. So using the flight of the projectile, it can then do calculations and tell you what weapon it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So you joined the army in 2009, left in 2013. My math is bad, but that's 4 years. What happened?
I went AWOL. No, I'm kidding. No, I'm kidding. There are serious consequences. There are serious consequences for going AWOL. And AWOL is absent without leave. There's serious consequences. A massive prison in Colchester, and it's a nightmare for serving personnel. I've heard stories. I've never been a troublemaker anyway, so there's no way I would have found myself there.
You could have fooled me.
I know. I know you'd believe it, but yeah, no, it's I couldn't go AWOL. So I suffered an injury very early in my career. I was on a great career trajectory, quick promotion, very technical job. And I was fantastic at the job, but the technical aspect of the job. If I told you what we used to do, we used to set up command posts on exercises. So there's forward operating bases in Afghanistan. We used to set up those set up the command posts from here. We used to prepare them from here, and then when they go, and then for deployments, we used to prepare them for deployments. We used to sort out the kit for them and HF equipment, including the cryptographic material that goes into the radios, in order to maintain a anonymity, or to make it difficult for enemies to pick up. But that's what we used to do. I think I've gone off a tangent here. I must.
Well,
Yeah.
I think to reminisce a bit, but I think it would be good if we come back to the reason that we asked you to come on today.
Yeah.
So basically, there's this strategic defense review that the Prime Minister's office published, which basically talks about ramping up defense spending in light of the perceived threats from what they are beginning to openly call enemies or adversaries, especially Russia and China. And so it's clearly a Europe-wide thing. It's clear that the security assumptions that Europeans, not just the British now, but all Europeans, at least all Western Europeans, have lived under for the past 70 years, are changing. The Americans are no longer 100% reliable. So they're all talking of ramping up defense spending. And I would just a brief introduction for other listeners. The welfare states, basically, or what some people derogatory call the nanny states, came about as a result of the Beveridge reports from 1942. And that report lays the foundation for the universal healthcare, the NHS that is so popular, pensions and unemployment benefits. And the idea, I think it's significant that it came in 1942 because people then had a very clear head about the fact that it was bad economic circumstances that led to the Second World War. Or to rephrase, not bad economic circumstances, terrible economic circumstances. So all of these systems were designed to prevent such things from happening. And by the 70s, welfare spending in the UK had reached about 25% of GDP, while defense spending has fallen from 7% in the 50s to 4%. And the end of the Cold War accelerated the fall in defense spending. So now they are talking of ramping up defense spending. Yesterday on Question Time, people were talking of making. There's going to be a meeting in NATO meeting, I think, in the coming few days, where the Americans are even going to push for 5%.
5%.
of GDP. And the concern is that the welfare state will suffer. The money has to come from somewhere. Clearly, aid, for example, aid to our home countries, or which in many cases are dysfunctional, has already taken a huge hit. But even the money that is saved in quotes from aid is not enough. So the concern is that the welfare state will be next, and that's what um is causing, for example, the protests that are happening in London today. We want to look at it from the point of view of immigrants. Well, I prefer the word expats because the three of us are good at what we do. So I personally always look, and both of you know this very well. I look at the whole term immigrant as very pejorative. So that's basically the crux of today's conversation.
Yeah, and to add in that, add to that, Cheta, you mentioned a few numbers. Let me just get on the back of that. So the foreign aid, as at now, the budget has already been reduced from 0.7% to 0.5% of the gross national income, and it's likely to drop to 0.3% in 2027. That was part of the reason that was given, and as you've rightly mentioned, was a need to buffer up the defense budget. But the thing is, with a reduction in that, also there's that drop. There's a decrease, not just in what can go to frontline services, but the cultural diplomacy. So we're going to see a cut in the budgets of people like British Council, BBC World Services, and all that. The question is, where is this money going to go into? Is it going to get more uh, JB Vundlas, or is it going to go into maybe other equipment? And it's good to bear in mind that if you look at the G7, for instance, the UK has, apart from Canada, the lowest number of active personnel in the G7. So the USA has 1.3 million active personnel. France has 205,000. Germany 181,000. Japan 247,000. Italy 170. The UK 72,000. Canada 68,000. And it's been widely joked about that the UK active personnel could fit into a football stadium. Now, the question is, how does the UK plan, or what are the effects on and of course I know you don't like this word, Cheta, for the sake of this argument, let's say the migrant community, how will the sudden need to ramp up defense spending affect those in the migrant communities? And by that we mean, JB, do you see an instance where for some reason the UK says, we're opening a new visa route, let's get more JBs in?
Well, more JBs in as in immigrants or as in army personnel?
No, immigrants into the army.
Immigrants into the army. Well, so things like defense spending. For me, because I've been looking at NATO and mostly the countries around NATO and the increase and what that means for the countries in NATO and where that increase will go. Most of that increase will go into weapon manufacturers. I don't see where else the money will go, or any benefit towards immigrant immigrant families or immigrants like us, or expatriates, as Cheta would say. Yeah, it's mostly economic, right? It's mostly driven by economic imperatives. And yes, that will absolutely affect the things like welfare for UK citizens more than it would affect migrants, because very few migrants have recourse to public funds.
Oh no, so it wasn't so much as to whether money will go to those families, or do you see? I guess maybe to have actually been clear in trying to increase the size, because I mean when you look at it, 72,000 active personnel is little compared to America's 1.3 million. So I think my question was around recruitment. And I've seen people in the UK say, look, I don't even know why, or if you look at the white British population, a lot of people are disenfranchised with the idea of fighting for the army. You see there's a push right now by the government to also start introducing lectures
Conscription.
Yeah, well, no conscription. That was sooner. But to introduce lectures around the military.
You're defending your labor guys.
Remind me, Cheta. No, but there are conversations around introducing lectures around the military in school so that kids can start learning about the military, hopefully with a view to recruiting them. But in the short term, because we know that, and JB, correct me if I'm wrong, but we know that it's people like you, boots on ground, that make a huge difference when it comes to warfare. Do you think that in the near future, migrants might be, just as has happened with Windrush, where people were told to come and help build the infrastructure and build the NHS, and right now healthcare, people are being brought in to work in those services. Do you think there's a possibility that in the future migrants might be enticed to join the UK military?
Well, so that's a much easier question for me to answer, right? So when I joined in 2009, they had gone through a period where they'd increased the barriers to entry. So they made it very difficult for you to join the army. Visa requirements like you have now. So for you to join the army, because they keep changing it, they keep shifting it depending on their manning needs. Now, when I joined the army, there was a huge influx of Commonwealth soldiers. Well, mostly Ghanaians, a few Nigerians. I had a Nigerian friend who lived close by. We went through the whole selection process together. They had relaxed, because you remember, I mentioned that I joined towards the tail end of Afghanistan, right? And the army was hemorrhaging soldiers at the time. If you remember Bassett and the gurneys around the town, and I think it was one of the things that forced the army's hand and forced them to withdraw from Afghanistan. So yeah, they reduced the barriers then. So it was very, very easy to join. I came in and joined straight from, got off the plane to the recruiting office. Had nice dreadlocks at the time. And one of the first things the recruiter said was, well, you're gonna have to lose your dreadlocks. There wasn't any. So normally they go, well, there's an interview or there's a barrier that you would have to you'd have to cross before you join. And she just went, well, you're gonna have to lose your hair. Went through the whole aptitude test, passed, and then it picked jobs for me. And I think I had 3 or 4 jobs. There's quite a few jobs I wasn't allowed to do. So even within the system's jobs that they won't allow you to take to do because of your immigration status. But for the most part, if you qualify, then you qualify. But what they tend to do is they look at their manning needs and they look at regiments that need men more. So at the time, the infantry needed men more. But my recruiter looked at my aptitude score and went, well, I wouldn't want to waste you in the infantry. Anyway, what I think is likely to happen in the next, because we're talking about perception here, or threat perception.
Yes.
So depending on how strong this perception is, it's very difficult to tell at the moment. Because where is the threat coming from? But they are more likely than not, and I think America is more likely to, or Trump is more likely to push the UK here to increase not only army spending, but army spending around army personnel. When you look at regular force, I think at the time we had only 100 active personnel in 2010, 2012. Army was tiny then, but it was big enough to fight and win, right? Because it had the equipment. But a lot of these adversaries have even more high-tech equipment these days. I mean, we're dealing with drones and first-person view drones, and that's something we didn't have in 4 or 5 years ago or prior to the Ukrainian war. So they're dealing with different threats here. So they are more likely to need more men from the Commonwealth because they won't get any men here. Now, only way they can... Yeah, go on.
So that, I think what you have said brings a question to mind. Do you think, as someone who served, that the cuts to the military went too far?
Second?
Do you think that the cuts to the military went too far?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. Because I think at the time, it boils down to threat perception again. At the time, there were very few threats. If you remember 2009, 2010, land of Afghanistan, there were no other wars in the horizon at the time. The cuts made sense. But what they did with the cuts because there's cuts and then there's gutting the army. They effectively gutted the army by merging some regiments, and just some important regiments were merged. I remember there used to be a regiment up north. I'm not going to say the name of the regiment up north. I used to know these places because we used to play football with them. Now they effectively gutted or just merged or removed the whole regiment and moved it elsewhere, moved it into another regiment. And it wasn't the only one. So if you look at most garrisons, one of the largest garrisons, or the largest garrison in the UK is Catterick Garrison, I think. And then there used to be Aldershot used to be one of the big ones. In the south, there's Bulford. And there's Borden. Borden is now a civilian area with housing. So a lot of army camps are now privately owned or privately rented. So the gutting has continued. I mean, the consequences and the effects of the gutting have continued. So yeah, we absolutely went too far. But it depends who you ask, I guess. It depends who you ask. I mean, if you ask the numbers people or the politicians, they'll say, look, well, it was necessary at the time. You know, we were trying to save money, or we had hemorrhaged money in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So the cuts made sense. So yeah, the answer to your question is absolutely.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Hold that thought. Let's go for a quick break. When we come back, then we'll carry on the conversation and perhaps talk more in depth about your experience in the military. Welcome back, guys. This is the Black Paper. My name is Ndụkwe Ọnụọha.
And I'm Chxta.
Before the break, we were talking about the general issues about military personnel and numbers and whether the cut to the military personnel before now went too far. But now, I think it's fair, having brought you on board, JB, we'll talk a bit about your experience in the military. And Chxta, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I mean, because this podcast is more about the immigrant experience, I think a direct question I'll ask is, how did your military service shape your views on British identity and belonging? And then were promises made to you about citizenship and post-service benefits? If yes, have those promises been kept? I know that's a long-winded question, but
yeah. Well, so no promises were made. I mean, everything I knew about the army, I knew because my brother served before me. So my brother joined in 2002, and he served in Iraq. So a lot of like everything I knew about the army, I'll get from him. And when I just decided to join the army, he was the conductor behind the scenes. He had left the army at the time, and he was the one effectively directing me and telling me where to go, or just helping me navigate the whole army ecosystem. Were promises made? No. But so you knew, join the army, you serve 4 years at the time anyway. You serve 4 years, and you qualify for recourse to public funds. But you already have recourse anyway in the army because you're not subject to immigration control like other immigrants. By that I mean you have a vignette in your passport that allows you to travel in and out of the UK within or the day you join. So you join, the army collects your passport, or your passport becomes their problem effectively. They stick an exemption, not a visa, an exemption for the duration of your service. You are exempt from immigration control, right? Of course, with the promise, not from them, with the promise from the system, because you apply the same way other immigrants do, and you apply the same way other immigrants do. And I find that problematic. I found that problematic because it's insane, if you ask me. And here's why: because service personnel are not immigrants, or yes, they are immigrants in the sense that the Commonwealth, they come from the Commonwealth, but they are not regular immigrants in the sense that they are risking their lives and serving or in service of the country. One of the things, you see, there's costs that everyone goes through, the amounts of money you pay to regularize your stay.
Yeah.
While you are exempt from immigration control, you are not exempt from those fees.
From those costs.
Right?
Yeah, I remember listening to someone on LBC a couple of months ago, and the presenter ended up apologizing to him because the guy is in the Royal Air Force and he still had to pay a ton load of money, and his citizenship has still not come through, and he's still serving in the Royal Air Force. So it's a letdown.
So is it fair to say, because we hear it's almost is a recurring theme these days when you see people come from, say, the Commonwealth to provide certain specialized services to the UK state. But somewhere down the line, it's almost like, oh, look, we forgot to tell you this, or not, maybe not we forgot to tell you this, but oh, look, this, if you think you have a special status, no. So take the Windrush scandal, for instance. We need people to come build this infrastructure. Here are the promises. At least in that case, certain promises were made. And then somewhere down the line, in the news about sometime last week, there was news of a man in his 60s who was being threatened with deportation, and this was all still linked to Windrush, someone who's lived all his life here. Of course, if he's 60, that means he wasn't the one that came over. So he was born here, lived all his life here, but then someone suddenly realizes, wait, hang on, you're not from here. We have the issue with more recently, the conversation around the white paper and how the doors were open for people to come help out in the healthcare, to work here, provide the help that certain people would not provide, and then suddenly, when it feels that things are on the up, you turn around and say, "Wait, hang on, how did you even get here in the first place? Should you be here?" And then of course, if you look at the case that Chxta just mentioned as well, this is someone who's still serving, and as you said, JB, putting their lives on the line to keep the rest of us safe. Someone who we should be thanking every day for their service. But somehow there's something there's a point at which you're always reminded. You might be here, but we are not so sure you're from here. So it is. How much of a problem is that?
Yeah. So I think there's a different culture to service or service personnel in the UK than there is in America, for instance. The service personnel are called squaddies here. It's a pejorative term. You're a squaddie. You're not a service person. Yes, you're a service person. I think when it's expedient for politicians, it's like, well, we service people as if they care. No one really cares about service personnel in this country, especially Commonwealth service personnel. Especially once you've signed on. Before you sign on, I have a couple of friends from the Caribbean. Now, the army recruits directly from the Caribbean in times of need, or in times of like manning shortages. When they have shortages, they go directly.
That sounds very Windrush.
Yes, yeah. They still do it to this day. So they will recruit directly. So it's when you start sharing stories. You're like, oh no, I joined here. Do they recruit in your country? They don't recruit in mine. So for me to join, I have to come here. Now, in 2025, I think you need leave to remain or citizenship to join. So before, you could come here today and tomorrow, right? As long as you're within your six months, whatever. As long as you have a visa, come join. Your passport becomes our problem, right? But yeah, I'm not sure what promises they make to the Caribbean Commonwealth. But having gone through the whole process myself, I think 2017, I wrote to two MPs. I wrote to the Member of Parliament for Basingstoke, and I wrote to Jeremy, and I wrote to Jeremy Hunt. Now, I have the email here. I have the email here somewhere. The long and short of it is that when someone you can tell this man can't do anything for you. That's what I concluded from the first email. This man is not going to help me. He'll pretend he doesn't have the power to do anything, and the system is so set in its ways that there's no way they'll make an exception or an exemption for a category of people. So they make things easy for commoner soldiers. We tried that, didn't work. We campaigned for a change in the law, for some sort of separate dispensation for commoner soldiers, because we are not immigrants. Even made a distinction once between myself and a fellow banner from Manchester. His name is Colum. I said, well, I wrote to Jeremy Hunt and I explained the differences, not the differences, the similarities between me and Colum. We do the same job. We get paid the same amount of money. I have a family. In 4 years, I'm going to have to pay this much. It was cheaper then. I'm going to have to pay this much. And then for citizenship, this much. The total amount, I think, was going to come up to about 15K. I asked them to think about the fairness of two people doing the same job, sacrificing their lives, and one having to pay 15K of money they don't have in order to regularize and stay. while at the same time serving and risking their life, because you could die in the army. You not from gunshots or active combat. You can die in an accident. You can fall into a ditch.
And that's another question. So, did you find that there were, or from your experience, was there also like a disparity in the way people were treated? Let's say people from the Commonwealth and those who were, or was it one big camaraderie?
Well, so the army is a strange environment. I had a conversation with someone yesterday, and I compared. Well, I made comparisons between the army and say prison, right?
Yes, I would like to.
Yeah, prison. We're talking about friendships, and I'm like, there's a camaraderie and friendship that you make in the army and in prison. I think it's a collective suffering. It's like we're in it together. It's the way you suffer through something together, and you emerge. I don't know,
Stronger and tighter.
stronger and tighter. Yeah. Emerge stronger and tighter. Like some of my friends, I don't talk to them much, and my wife always was like, it always baffles her. It's like, you guys don't talk much, but once a year or something, one of the friends I would call, and we spend an hour on the phone. How does that work? I'm like, well, that's male friendship. That's male friendship.
No, don't worry. Those things, women don't never understand those things.
Like, but is he your friend? I'm like, yo, of course, my boy. So yeah, these bonds that form during collective suffering, or just collective pain that endure and last and last and last. So yeah.
I think an interesting thing, and I would like to get the thoughts of both of you on this, because one of the things that I hear, especially with the changing requirements for recruitment, is very similar to, so for example, the UK recruited a lot of doctors from Nigeria and from Ghana during COVID. So it appears that whenever there's a need, they have no problems easing up entry requirements, and then the moment that need is filled, they basically raise the drawbridge. Do you worry that ebb and flow will end up targeting, so will create an anti-immigrant sentiment that could target veterans such as yourself? I mean, personally, I think that the anti-immigrant sentiment will target people like myself and Ndụkwe, who are not veterans. But now asking about veterans specifically, but what do you think about that general behavior and the kind of atmosphere it creates? Does it help in creating a truly patriotic Brit from an immigrant?
Well, I think it creates it creates a caste system between immigrants. So it creates some sort of class system, where one immigrant student can go, look, I served this country, and then go, oh, no, you're fine. It reminds me of I can't remember. There's a comedian, with Dave Chappelle, who likes to say, you go on a diatribe about white people, and then he will see one white person in the audience. Go, no, not you, you're fine.
That's Chris Rock.
That's Chris Rock, right?
Yeah, not
Yeah.
you. You paid. You're fine.
You're fine. So I think so. Whether it changes anything, the sentiment about immigrants, this country has mastered the art of I would say using people. No. So the art of, when there's a shortage somewhere, and they need to fill that shortage, they'll do whatever it takes to fill that shortage.
Expendables.
Well, yes, but this is there's mutual benefit here. So let's not kid ourselves.
True.
There's an element of mutual benefit, but it boils down to the idea of interest. Where you go, well, sometimes interests converge, but someone tells, or your interests, you don't know what the interests are. For some, it's strategic interest. For some, it's economic interest. For most migrants, we just want to make a living, man. Yeah, it's just opportunity. It's just an opportunity. In my case, it's like you've hit a ceiling somewhere. I learned this very early. That when you hit a ceiling somewhere, or you can move, you can change your postcode, and your challenges will change, right?
True.
Or what you consider challenges before are no longer challenges. I'll give you an example. When I moved here, one thing I found quite shocking was quite shocking was the price of cars here, right? I would walk around dealerships, and look at cars. I'm like, what's this, £1,000? In my mind, £5,000, 5,000 rand.
The classic
But okay,
immigrant dilemma.
right? And you start converting in your head. You're like, okay, it's not 5,000 rand. Maybe it's 55,000. Still cheaper than like we pay for a car, like a similar class car back home. So yeah, things like that kind of I think fit into this idea of well, your challenges now change because you've moved. You can now afford this car, right? 2 months salary in South Africa at the time, 5,000. Jesus, I was on 8,000 a month, and I was one of the highest paid. I was well paid in what 2007. I was very well paid. Even then, I couldn't afford a £5,000 car here converted to 55,000. I couldn't afford a 55,000 car.
Yeah, so and it's true. There is a huge element of mutual benefit. Let's not let's not kid ourselves around that. You just maybe sometimes because of the sentimental value we attach to that relocating, because for us, you're trying to catch up with a life that could have been, and you're hoping that things really work here, and you're trying to catch up to maybe 40 years worth of experience in 5 or so years, and so that every turn then becomes some sort of a letdown if things don't work as they are. But going back to your original question, Cheta, I do find as well that there's that convenience of when it is needed. The Commonwealth becomes almost like a readily available endless pool of resources that can be drawn upon, and when it matters, forgotten. So I'll give you an example. When you look at VE Day or Remembrance Day celebrations here, you could almost swear that there was no contribution by the African continent in the ending of both the First and the Second World Wars. Just a side note, I've made it a point that during the Remembrance Day celebrations, I go with a touch of yellow and black in remembrance of the West African frontier forces who served and died, gave their lives to empire. But, in the First World War, you had the King's African Rifles, mostly, fighting in East Africa. So Kenya, Uganda, Malawi, Tanzania. You had, I've mentioned the West African Frontier Forces, Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Gambia, and they all fought in Cameroon against the Germans. And then, of course, you had from across Africa as well. Second World War, there was still the King's African Rifles, there was the Royal Air Force, there was the African Pioneer Corps. In French, you have the Tirailleurs Sénégalais.
By their French, by their
Yeah, so, but if you were to happen upon a VE Day or a Remembrance Day celebration, you will not know that in service of empire, people from this continent who, let's be honest, had no business in these wars, because there was no somebody in no African went to shoot someone in Austria. No, we're busy trying to get the colonial boots off our necks, but somehow we became a continuous resource to be shipped off to go fight for what we had no idea, but because we're part of that empire. And it then translates to modern days where, as you said, people will go and recruit from the Caribbean. But at the end of the day, once you finish serving, except if they have a separate arrangement, you still have to go pay, depending on the size of your family, 10, 5, 15,000 pounds for the right to be here. And then somewhere down the line, Nigel Farage stands up and says, "You're the problem." Kemi Badenoch says, "Of course you're the problem." And sadly, the UK government, Keir Starmer, stands and says, "Okay, you know what? We're going to make it even harder for you to regularize your stay." The thing is, will we ever learn?
Well, I think for that we will not learn, and this is something that myself and JB have discussed extensively. Your average African country is not properly designed, not properly structured, so we're still going to keep having problems for a long time, and those problems will create that reservoir of immigrants that countries such as this can tap into whenever they feel a need. I'm of the opinion that there will be a need maybe 5 years down the line for more people, and suddenly the immigration debate will change. I also think that as time goes on and with the falling birth rate and aging population and all of that, they will need more people. I think these are the scenarios that I think that in the short term the military spending thing will win out. out, the military spending will rise and welfare will be trimmed. So, for example, you'll see caps to benefits. You'll see the NHS will be made a bit tighter. But I think that in the long term, especially if the recruitment crisis persists, they will actually reduce the requirements for recruitment, and especially if there's a spark in East Asia and you have conflict over Taiwan, the UK will definitely reduce the requirements to recruit people from overseas.
Absolutely.
And this is sorry, Karen, JB.
Yeah, absolutely. So, your earlier submission, Ndụkwe, reminded me of something me and Cheta have discussed quite extensively. The idea of stories. And remember when I said telling the authentic African story from us, but for us, it's the sort of story we tell within our collective as Africans. Because if you don't tell that story, someone else will tell that story for you. When they tell that story, becomes I to remember. If you remember the Trump white genocide ambush at the White House.
It was comical, to say the least.
Yeah. But while it was comical, here's what I took out of that interaction. We have a settler community that conquered our lands in the 1600s, but left. Right now, that's the context. But when you listen to them tell their story, and that's why we need good press. That's why we need good storytellers to tell our story. When you tell that story, you then add in the context, or you make sure there's context in the story. Because the context is that they stole the land; it doesn't belong to them. Stole, in legal speak, there was no exchange of consideration. There was no exchange of value. Finders keepers is not a thing in law. Finders keepers unjust enrichment. Right. That's why we don't know about these stories of who served where. When you read Western history is just the chronicles of Western explorers, who they see Africans as anthropological experiments. The importance of telling an African story ourselves, right? In the absence of historical account, because most of us lost our history. Story that we can tell within ourselves, and the story that that then turns into a narrative that then filters out, becomes, when everyone hears it and goes, well, this is the story of the Africans. So how do you know this story? Well, the Africans told it themselves. We're going to tell this African story ourselves. So when you listen to those people in the White House telling a lie, a bold-faced lie, about how they're victims of some genocide. I mean, when you look at the numbers from last year, between 24 and 27,000 people, South Africa. The one was a farmer. The one was a white farmer. Out of the 27,000 now, but that's a genocide, and yet Gaza is not a genocide. It's insane. But towards the end of this, I think you will then talk about the future for the UK, and I'll bring this in when we start talking about the future for the UK. And the implications, I guess, of what we've seen in the past 2 years.
Oh no, this would be a good time to bring it in because we're slowly running out of time. But yeah, you made a very good point there.
Yeah.
Even in the telling of events, even when they're almost trying to keep to historical accuracies, the slant to which they can be told, then becomes problematic. So, for instance, I know I mentioned in the last episode about the About Women's Uprising, but then when it's being told, it's being called the About Women's Riot. Like,
that's a colonialism of language.
Yeah, it's that semantics.
A riot delegitimizes it.
Yes.
But it's no different. The About Women's Uprising was really no different from the no taxation without representation mantra of the people who protested against Britain in 1776. And interestingly, the British initially called George Washington and the rest of them traitors.
And Mandela was a terrorist until he became a national figure. With as you mentioned, with Israel, Gaza, everything was okay until suddenly it wasn't. And then suddenly, I think what we're beginning to learn is that there's this thing of collective amnesia in politics where we forget what we have said or what we have not said, what we have done or not done in the past in 1 year, and suddenly when the narrative is right, when it's good for everyone to be collectively outraged, we jump on it with no mention of just how we got to this place. And it's weird. It's it's like gaslighting pro max.
Well, it's collective. It's performative outrage. It's performative outrage. But also, the flip side of the stories thing that I've learned as an immigrant in the UK is that stories, that is a chasm between values professed and values espoused, right? By the West or the collective West in general, because they'll say they're one thing, and you're like, are you really, right? Listen to definitions, going back to semantics, where you say, well, what is a terrorist? At university, terrorism is the use of violence for political ends. But you're like, well, it's not terrorism if it's done by our allies. Terrorism is something that happens to us. Even if you're defending yourself against our terrorism, you're still a terrorist.
Okay, so thanks so much, JB. I think final thoughts because we've pretty much run out of time. So final thoughts, and I think it would be nice so I go first with my final thoughts on the main topic. JB, very briefly and succinctly, then Ndụkwe, you wrap it up. I think that so we're in 2025. I think that by 2030, Britain would probably have a smaller but more tech-focused military. The welfare state will suffer, but the suffering of the welfare state will lead to social unrest, and the duopoly will continue because they will need people. So they will still be doing the rhetoric against migrants, but bringing in more migrants through the back door. That's what I see over the next 5 years. JB, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you to see a rise in boots in military personnel now. Because you obviously can't conquer territory on horseback. Sooner or later you're gonna have to dismount. Yeah, absolutely.
You just reminded me of my masters where one of my lecturers said the ultimate weapon is a man on the ground with a gun. Ndụkwe, your own thought.
Yeah, my last thought is, look, it's we need to continue to remember and celebrate our contributions to keeping the peace all over the world, whether voluntarily or involuntarily. Our stories, as JB has said, must continue to be told, and we must be the ones to tell them.
So that maybe a final word for me then. 1.3 million Africans served Britain and its allies in the Second World War.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thanks, everyone. See you at the next one.
Thanks for joining us, JB.
My pleasure.
Bye.